Europe has long relied on natural gas to power its cities, fuel its factories, and heat its homes. And in recent years, about 40% of that gas came from Russia. But this year, Europe is bracing for an energy war.
Russia is deliberately cutting us off.
We are working on the worst possible scenario.
In recent months, Russia has slashed gas flows, aiming an economic weapon at Europe. Now, leaders are preparing for the possibility that Russian President Vladimir Putin will keep gas flows at a trickle or cut them off altogether to try to gain leverage as he continues to wage his war in Ukraine. So here's what could happen and how it could affect you, whether you're in Europe or not. First, let's talk about a really important pipeline, the Nord Stream 1. It runs under the Baltic Sea, connecting Russia's prolific Siberian gas fields to Germany, Europe's biggest economy. From there, some of that gas is re-exported to other European countries. Even though there are other pipelines sending gas from Russia to Europe, the Nord Stream 1 handles about half of all piped flows to the continent. Back in June, Russia's state-owned gas giant Gazprom started reducing the gas sent through the pipeline, eventually cutting exports by 60%. And check this out. As flows were reduced, you can see that prices started to spike in Europe. Russia essentially blamed Western sanctions for the slowdown, pointing to a turbine that was undergoing maintenance in Canada and got held up there. But several European leaders didn't buy that explanation.
All this is part of Russia's strategy to undermine our unity.
Even though Canada ultimately agreed to return the turbine, Western leaders began to worry that the Nord Stream 1 wouldn't reopen at full capacity or even reopen at all when it was closed for routine maintenance in July. A few of the analysts I talked to say that's not some far-flung fear. It's looking like a real risk, and they no longer think that Nord Stream 1 flows will return to normal. Even if Russia doesn't cut Europe off entirely and just sends less gas than expected, it'll still cause ripple effects around the world. Why? Because European governments could be forced to ration gas. Storage tanks are typically filled during the summer, but they're already running low. And officials have begun urging citizens to reduce their energy use and start preparing for a tough winter. And companies are also bracing to get hit hard, since natural gas is used to make everything from fertilizer and glass to copper and cars. Some manufacturers told the Journal they might be forced to make fewer products or stop production altogether. A gas shortage would be particularly painful for Germany because it's a manufacturing powerhouse that exports a huge amount of our goods. And since it's the world's fourth biggest economy, what happens in Germany doesn't stay in Germany. Economists predict that Europe would experience a painful recession if Russia tightens the gas taps. And no matter where you are in the world, you could feel the effects. Think more supply chain headaches, more expensive goods, steeper electricity bills, and potentially even higher interest rates as countries grapple with rising inflation. So how are European governments responding? In the long term, they're working to wean themselves off of Russian fossil fuels altogether. But that process is expected to take about 5 years, so in the short term, they're scrambling to get ahead of a winter crisis.
We need to make sure that in case of full disruption, the gas flows towards where it's needed most.
In addition to deciding who would get dibs on gas, officials are scouring the globe to strike gas deals in places like Azerbaijan, Norway, and the US. This chart from the IEA shows just how much Europe has turned toward liquefied natural gas from the US in recent months. June marked the first month ever that the EU imported more natural gas from the US via ships than it did from Russia via pipeline. Some European countries are also restarting coal-fired plants and reversing plans to close nuclear reactors, controversial steps that leaders say are necessary. Still, the IEA is warning that a looming gas crunch poses a historic test for Europe, and that Europe must remain united to get through it. So what does all of this mean for Russia? Russia has denied using gas to advance its political goals, and Putin has blamed Western nations for rising prices.
Все это еще раз показывает, что санкционные ограничения в отношении России гораздо больший ущерб наносят именно тем странам, которые их и вводят.
Cutting gas to Europe would be a high-stakes move by Moscow. Russia relies on oil and gas sales for about 45% of the government's revenues. And cutting Europe off would jeopardize Russia's standing as a reliable energy partner. Plus, it would force Russia to depend more on China. That's why many analysts think it's more likely that Russia will send a smaller flow of gas to the continent instead of cutting it off entirely. That way, Russia could capitalize on higher prices and still deal a painful blow to Europe.